In the afternoon haze of June 4, 1942, as black columns of smoke curled upward from the shattered wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, a quiet dread began to settle over the officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Hiryu still fought, but even she would soon join her sisters beneath the Pacific. 4 fleet carriers, half of Kido Butai, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled, were gone in a matter of hours. Yet the horror that gripped Japan's high command was not only the tactical disaster unfolding at Midway, it was the realization, whispered among staff officers and never fully voiced aloud, America could replace what it lost. Japan could not. The truth revealed itself brutally quickly. A few months earlier, Japanese intelligence had estimated that the United States might take years to recover from the losses at Pearl Harbor and in the early Pacific battles. But even before Midway began, yards at Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia were already laying down the keels of Essex-class carriers, hulls CV-9 through CV-18. And while the Japanese fleet burned, American factories accelerated, not slowed. To Admirals Nagumo and Yamamoto, this industrial surge was invisible during battle, but to Admiral Ugaki, reading intercepted American production data weeks later, it was terrifying. Japan had entered the war believing that decisive battles, decapitation strikes, could cripple a nation the way Tsushima had crippled the Russian Empire. But the United States was not an empire held together by willpower alone. It was a country with an industrial engine so vast it absorbed the shock of Midway, the way a mountain absorbs a stone. Japan had lost 4 carriers it spent a decade building. America had already planned more than twice that number before 1943. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, as rescue vessels retrieved the few survivors and as stunned pilots tried to make sense of the catastrophe, another fear began spreading through the combined fleet. The Americans had lost Yorktown just once, but they could replace her many times. Yorktown, the only fleet carrier the U.S. lost at Midway, had been repaired in 72 hours before the battle and returned to fight immediately. Japanese officers could scarcely understand such speed. Their own damaged carriers required months in dry dock in yards that were already overstretched. Shokaku, badly damaged in the Coral Sea, had taken nearly 2 months to restore. Zuikaku missed Midway entirely because Japan lacked the trained pilots to replace her lost air crews. This imbalance was not just numerical, it was structural. After Midway, American shipyards switched to wartime acceleration, hull sections prefabricated like an assembly line, welding instead of riveting, trains carrying steel day and night from Pittsburgh to East Coast ports. While Japan struggled to lay down Taiho and Shinano under air raids and material shortages, the United States laid down Essex after Essex, each one larger, faster, and more survivable than any pre-war design. Inside the combined fleet's underground headquarters at Hashirajima, officers pored over the casualty lists. The loss of the carriers was catastrophic. But worse than the hulls was the destruction of the carrier air groups, hundreds of elite pilots trained over years. Japan did not have the training capacity to replace them quickly. By contrast, the United States had already built massive flight schools in Florida, Texas, and California, capable of graduating thousands of pilots every month. The realization struck Japanese planners with increasing weight. Midway was the last battle Japan would fight with a veteran air group. The next generation would be outnumbered and outtrained. Even before the wreckage of Kido Butai settled on the ocean floor, American workers were riveting together the hangar decks of future carriers that would dominate the Pacific: Essex, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Ticonderoga. Each ship represented an industrial promise Japan could not match. If America lost a carrier, it would simply build another one, and another, and another. Japanese war planners studied the numbers obsessively in the weeks after Midway. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States would produce 24 fleet carriers. Japan, struggling with shortages of steel, fuel, and trained shipbuilders, would complete only a handful of new carriers after Midway, and most of those were desperate wartime conversions, not true fleet carriers. The imbalance became more than strategic, it became psychological. Japanese commanders began whispering the phrase, Mugen no Kukan, the endless void. when referring to American production. They felt as though they were fighting an enemy that did not bleed, or if it did, the wound closed instantly. When Ugaki wrote in his diary that July, he captured the moment of dread in a single sentence. America's strength is not her fleet, but her ability to make another fleet. This was the fear that grew in Japan's naval command after Midway. Not simply fear of losing carriers, but fear of fighting a nation that had turned shipbuilding into an industrial art. Japan's craftsmanship was exquisite, but craftsmanship could not defeat factories working in 3 shifts, welding steel plates together like mass-produced automobiles. As the months passed and the first Essex-class carriers entered service, Essex herself in December 1942, followed by Lexington, CV-16, Bunker Hill, Yorktown, CV-10, and dozens more, Japan realized a truth that chilled every admiral who studied the Pacific map. Midway had not crippled America, it had awakened it. The Americans were not merely replacing Yorktown, they were building the largest carrier fleet the world had ever seen. And for Japanese commanders watching their own resources shrink with each passing month, that was the beginning of a fear that would define the rest of the Pacific War. What Japan failed to understand in 1941, but learned with suffocating clarity by 1943, was that the United States had not merely committed to building ships, it had committed its entire industrial civilization to the destruction of the Axis. When the first Essex-class carriers slid into the water in late 1942, Japanese observers initially believed they were witnessing isolated launches. They did not yet realize they were looking at the leading edge of a tidal wave. The Essex was not a ship, it was a product, one born from a manufacturing process so refined, so synchronized, so limitless in scale that by 1944, American carriers were appearing in the Pacific faster than the Japanese Navy could track them. And the Japanese commanders who studied intelligence reports described the experience with one word: kikai, the machine. The machine began in the shipyards, where American engineers applied mass production principles honed by Detroit and Pittsburgh. Instead of building a ship from the keel upward in a slow, linear process, the U.S. Navy adopted modular construction. Whole sections of hull, flight deck, engine compartments, and hangar spaces were fabricated in separate workshops and then welded together like pieces of a colossal steel puzzle. It was the opposite of Japan's artisanal approach, where shipyards relied on skilled manual riveting and limited industrial automation. When a Japanese carrier required more than a year to complete, even under ideal conditions, the American yards could assemble an Essex in months. By 1943, the scale had become astonishing. Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, and the massive Bethlehem steel facilities buzzed day and night with shifts of welders, crane operators, electricians, and riveters, men and women, who worked with the speed and precision of an army. Millions of tons of steel flowed in from the Great Lakes region. Factories that once built cars now built components for flight decks and bow sections. The War Production Board ensured that no yard ever lacked fuel, workers, or raw materials. This uninterrupted flow of resources meant delays simply didn't exist. At sea, the results were impossible to ignore. Even as Japanese ships burned in the Solomons and as their carriers dwindled to a handful, America seemed to conjure new ones from nothing. Essex herself joined the fleet in December 1942. Bunker Hill, Yorktown, CV-10, Lexington, CV-16, Intrepid, Lexington, and others followed in rapid succession, each one a near copy of the last, allowing for standardized training, maintenance, and logistics. The Japanese Navy, operating a mix of aging pre-war carriers, emergency conversions, and lightly armored decks, found itself fighting a force that seemed to grow with every battle. What unsettled Japanese intelligence most was the tempo of American launches. In 1943, the U.S. commissioned 8 Essex-class carriers. In 1944, 11 more. Before the war ended, 24 fleet carriers of the Essex and Midway classes would be completed, a number so vast that the Imperial Navy could not conceptualize it. Japan had spent nearly 2 decades creating Kido Butai. America replaced Kido Butai twice over in just 3 years. And then there was training. A carrier was useless without its IR group, but America solved that bottleneck too. Naval Air Training Commands in Corpus Christi, Pensacola, and Glenview produced pilots in numbers that dwarfed Japanese capacity. Flight instructors rotated out of combat units, bringing frontline experience to new aviators. By contrast, Japan's elite pilots died faster than they could be replaced. The loss of air crews at Midway and again in the Solomons left Japan with hollow decks, carriers without pilots. The Americans had the opposite problem, pilots waiting for ships. As Japan studied American output, government analysts delivered increasingly bleak assessments to Tokyo. One report from late 1943 concluded, "The enemy will soon possess more carriers than we possess destroyers." Another warned that the Essex line alone, if uninterrupted, would produce enough flight decks to overwhelm any defensive perimeter Japan could build. This was the terror of the Essex machine, not the individual ship, but the system behind it. A single Essex was formidable, fast, heavily armored, carrying nearly 100 aircraft with long range and high survivability. But an Essex was never alone. They sailed in task groups of 4, 6, or even 8. And every few months, another one sailed out of a shipyard with a fresh air group. There was no pause, no window to recover, no attrition Japan could inflict that America could not erase through production. By the time the Americans began the Central Pacific Drive, Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, and Philippines, the Japanese commanders understood that they were facing not just ships, but a relentless, growing organism. When one carrier took torpedo damage, another arrived to replace it. When an air group suffered losses, replacement aircrew and pilots filled the decks within days. The Essex machine did more than build carriers. It destroyed Japan's strategic planning. Every Japanese counter-strategy assumed a finite American fleet, a fleet that could be worn down over time. But what do you do when the enemy fleet grows faster than you can sink it? When every victory subtracts nothing from the total? When the enemy's industrial capacity is so vast that even catastrophic losses would barely delay operations? By 1944, American admirals like Spruance and Michener could launch simultaneous operations that Japan simply couldn't counter. Carrier Task Force 5-8 struck the Marianas, while other Essex groups covered New Guinea and the Marshalls. Japan watched helplessly, unable to match force with force or even move assets fast enough to meet threats. The Imperial Navy had been built for decisive battles. The Americans now fielded a navy that could fight decisive battles every month. And as intelligence officers traced the rapid expansion of American shipbuilding, a grim realization spread through Japan's naval staff. This was only the beginning. America was not producing at maximum capacity yet. More carriers were coming, larger, tougher, even more heavily armored. The machine was still accelerating. In the end, Japanese commanders feared the Essex not for what it was, but for what it represented. A nation whose industrial strength turned war into something Japan could no longer influence. A nation whose navy never stopped growing. If the Essex-class carriers were the steel sledgehammers of America's naval resurgence, then the Escort carriers, the humble CVEs, were the relentless swarm that Japan never saw coming. They were small, slow, lightly armored, and, in any pre-war naval doctrine, utterly unremarkable. Yet from 1942 to 1945, the United States produced an astonishing 122 escort carriers, more flat-deck ships than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed in every category combined. And far from being secondary assets, these CVEs soon became the backbone of America's ocean strategy, hunting submarines, covering convoys, supporting amphibious assaults, and flooding the Pacific skies with aircraft in numbers Japan could not hope to counter. For Japanese commanders, the Essex-class was terrifying because it represented overwhelming force. The escort carriers were terrifying because they represented something worse, overwhelming permanence. Even if Japan somehow managed to sink an Essex or inflict losses on a major task force, CVEs kept coming, inexhaustible, unstoppable, like the industrial heartbeat of a continent. Escort carriers were born from America's industrial improvisation. They used merchant hulls, welded decks, and standardized parts. Kaiser shipyards could build one in a few months. Some took only 90 days from keel to commissioning, a pace inconceivable in Japan's artisanal naval yards, where even a small carrier required meticulous handcrafting and months of scarce labor. The Japanese Navy built ships as masterpieces. The Americans built them as products, and the product kept multiplying. By mid-1943, these jeep carriers, as American sailors called them, were appearing everywhere. In the Atlantic, they devastated Admiral Donitz's U-boat fleet. In the Pacific, they escorted the endless convoys of fuel, ammunition, and men that sustained America's island-hopping campaign. To Japanese observers, the scale of this movement seemed almost supernatural. In 1942, a Japanese submarine patrolling the Central Pacific expected empty seas or isolated convoys. By 1944, every convoy had air cover, dozens of FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers overhead, ready to pounce on any submarine foolish enough to surface. This shift obliterated one of Japan's most important strategic assumptions, that the United States could not protect the thousands of miles of ocean needed to project power westward. Japan had relied on submarines and long-range reconnaissance to disrupt American logistics. But now, every Japanese submarine that surfaced risked being spotted, chased, depth-charged, or bombed by aircraft launched from tiny carriers Japan had not imagined America could build in such numbers. Escort carriers also transformed amphibious warfare. At Tarawa, Kwajalein, Aniwatek, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, CVEs ringed the landing zones, providing constant close air support. Fighters strafed trenches, destroyed machine gun nests, and created smoke screens. Torpedo bombers struck supply dumps and artillery positions. Even when fleet carriers focused on air superiority or strategic strikes, escort carriers ensured Marines and soldiers had immediate support from dawn to dusk. Japanese coastal defenders expected American aircraft to appear only in waves, brief strikes followed by long intervals. Instead, CVE pilots flew constantly, landing for fuel and ammunition before returning to the same targets minutes later. To the Japanese troops exposed to this rhythm, it felt like the Americans had limitless planes. In truth, they had something close: the ability to pull any damaged aircraft below deck, repair it, and launch it again within hours. Japanese planes often sat idle for days awaiting parts. The Americans kept their small carriers functioning like floating garages, always producing, always launching. The significance of these escort carriers became undeniable during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, particularly at Samar on October 25, 1944. There, a task unit of 6 escort carriers, Taffy 3, found itself facing the full might of Japan's center force: battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. By all logic, the CVEs should have been annihilated. Instead, they fought back with such ferocity, launching continuous air attacks, dodging shells, deploying smoke, and inspiring destroyer crews to suicidal bravery, that the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Kurita, believed he was fighting fleet carriers. He withdrew. The Japanese Navy had been defeated in part by ships they had dismissed as insignificant. What unsettled Japanese analysts afterwards was not just the tactical result, but the strategic implication. Even America's weakest carriers were strong enough to change the outcome of the largest naval battle of the war. Meanwhile, Japan attempted to expand its own carrier fleet. But after Midway, most new carriers were conversions, junior ships like Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, or desperate late-war experiments like Ibuki, which was never completed. Only Taiho and Shinono represented true fleet carrier designs, and both were lost quickly. Taiho sunk at the Philippine Sea, and Shinono sunk during sea trials. While Japan struggled to bring 1 or 2 new ships into service, America commissioned escort carriers in dozens. The ratio became absurd. By early 1945, for every Japanese carrier that could sortie, America had 20. And even if an Essex or Independence-class carrier was damaged, the CVEs filled the gaps, ensuring there was never a single day from 1943 onward that American forces lacked carrier air cover. For Japanese naval officers, this was the most demoralizing revelation of all. They were fighting a nation whose naval power was not merely large, it was self-replenishing. Sink one ship, and 3 would appear. Destroy a convoy, and 10 more would follow with carriers escorting them. Japan's navy grew weaker with each loss. America's navy grew stronger every month. In captured documents reviewed after the war, Japanese strategists admitted something they could never publicly state. The United States' escort carrier fleet made the Pacific unwinnable. If the Essex-class represented American might, then the CVEs represented American inevitability. And inevitability was something no Japanese admiral could defeat. By early 1944, Japanese naval commanders were living in the shadow of a nightmare they could not escape. Every time the Imperial Navy lost a ship, the American Navy grew stronger. Every carrier sunk at Midway, every cruiser damaged in the Solomons, every pilot killed over Guadalcanal was supposed to weaken the United States. Instead, by the spring of 1944, the Pacific Fleet was assembling the largest concentration of carrier power in human history. It was not simply a fleet, it was an avalanche, and Japan stood directly in its path. The scale of American growth became undeniable during Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas. The Japanese combined fleet, once feared as the spear of Kido Butai, sailed to confront the U.S. Fifth Fleet, believing that their newly built carriers Zukaku, Shokaku, Taiho, Junyo, and Hyo could challenge American expansion. What they found instead was an armada of staggering proportions: 15 fleet carriers, dozens of escort carriers, hundreds of support ships, and more than 900 carrier aircraft. Task Force 58 under Admiral Spruance and Mitzer dwarfed anything Japan had ever faced. Even before the battle began, Japanese scouts radioed back with a sense of awe bordering on disbelief. The enemy has more carriers than we have fighters. This imbalance was not merely numerical, it was qualitative. Japanese pilots, once the elite of the world, had been bled dry in the Solomons. Their replacements had only months of training. American pilots, by contrast, were seasoned, disciplined, and backed by a logistics system that could rotate air groups, replace damaged aircraft, and deliver aviation fuel in quantities Japan could not imagine. Each Essex-class carrier carried nearly 100 aircraft. Task groups operated in tight formation, so tight that Japanese pilots mistook multiple carriers for a single giant ship because their flight decks blended together from a distance. The result was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, known forever in American memory as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. When Japanese air groups launched their first strike on June 19, 1944, they expected to find isolated carriers or vulnerable transports. Instead, they flew into a layered fortress of radar interception, fighter direction officers, Hellcats launched in perfect timing, and anti-aircraft guns firing proximity-fused shells. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. Many never even sighted an American ship. For Japanese commanders, this was the moment the avalanche became undeniable. Their carriers survived the first day, but they no longer had air groups to operate them. And then came the final blow, the sinking of Taiho and Shokaku, both torpedoed by submarines, both lost to catastrophic internal explosions caused by fuel vapor, symptoms of Japan's inferior damage control doctrines and rushed wartime construction. With those losses, Japan's carrier force was effectively finished. But America's was not. Even as Shokaku slipped beneath the waves, even as Taiho ruptured from within, the U.S. Navy continued commissioning new Essex-class carriers: Ticonderoga, Hancock, Bennington, Randolph, Antietam. By the end of 1944, the American fleet would deploy more fleet carriers than Japan had aircraft. This was not hyperbole. Japan, desperate and starving, produced only about 1,300 carrier-capable aircraft in 1944, many of them obsolete. The United States built nearly 40,000 combat aircraft in the same year. Japan's admirals faced a truth too large to even debate. They could no longer replace losses. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable. Every carrier sunk was a decade of naval power erased. Every battle fought left them weaker. Meanwhile, the Americans returned from each engagement with new ships, new squadrons, and updated tactics. The U.S. Navy did not merely endure attrition, it thrived under it. By the time of the Leyte Gulf operations in October 1944, the imbalance had reached biblical proportions. Japan mustered 4 task forces: Northern, Central, Southern, and the decoy carrier group under Osawa. But the decoy was a tragic symbol. Carriers without effective air groups sent out as bait to draw off the American fleet. Japan was now using its remaining carriers not as weapons, but as sacrifices. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, deployed 17 fleet and light carriers and nearly 20 escort carriers during the battle. American carrier decks overflowed with Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers. Japanese decks were barren. And yet, even this overwhelming American strength continued to grow. More Essex-class carriers were finishing sea trials. The gigantic Midway-class, CVB 41, 42, and 43, were nearing completion, offering armored flight decks and air groups larger than any carrier ever built to that point. Japan had no answer, no equivalent, not even a hope of matching such ships. Shinano, meant to be Japan's supercarrier, sank on her maiden voyage after a handful of torpedo hits. The industrial contrast was so extreme that Japanese officers stopped trying to estimate American production. Every prediction they made was too low. Captured Japanese documents reveal a pattern of despair that deepened through 1944. One staff officer wrote, "The enemy does not fear losing carriers. We fear losing one." Another noted, "Their fleet is like a tree that grows a new branch each day. Ours is a tree struck by lightning, losing branches faster than we can carve new ones." By the end of 1944, the United States Navy possessed more carrier tonnage, more aircraft, and more trained pilots than Japan had possessed at any point in history. The avalanche had reached its terminal velocity. Nothing Japan could build, improvise, or imagine would stop it now. For Japanese commanders, 1944 was not simply the year the tide turned. It was the year the tide became a flood. The year they realized the truth no warrior wants to acknowledge. The war was unwinnable, not because of strategy, but because of arithmetic. No matter how bravely their pilots fought, no matter how cleverly their admirals maneuvered, they could not fight a navy that grew larger after every battle. They could not fight a nation whose shipyards ran day and night, forging carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. And so the fear that began at Midway reached its full shape in 1944. A fear of a navy that did not merely exist, but expanded. A navy that replaced its losses instantly. A navy that, for the first time in world history, had achieved true industrial immortality. By early 1945, as the flames of the Pacific War closed in on the Japanese homeland, the surviving officers of the Imperial Navy confronted a truth they had long suspected but never dared articulate. The United States was no longer merely operating a powerful navy. It was operating a naval production ecosystem so vast, so disciplined, and so technologically advanced that no maritime nation in history had ever faced anything like it. The final proof came in the form of the Midway-class carriers, the new leviathans of the U.S. fleet, sliding into the water even as the war approached its end. These ships were not just improvements on the Essex-class. They were the physical embodiment of an enemy whose industrial engine had outpaced Japan so completely that the outcome of the war seemed preordained in hindsight. The Midway-class carriers, huge, armored, and capable of carrying air groups larger than entire Japanese naval air flotillas, were designed during the darkest months of 1942 but matured by 1945 into a class of ship that no Axis nation could have matched even in theory. At more than 45,000 tons displacement, with armored flight decks, expanded hangars, and powerful hydraulic catapults, they represented the next generation of naval warfare. But what terrified Japanese planners most was not the Midway class itself. It was the realization that America had finished building the Essex fleet, was commissioning escort carriers by the dozen, and still had enough excess industrial capacity to begin constructing an entirely new supercarrier class while conducting multiple amphibious invasions, maintaining a global supply chain, and fighting two wars simultaneously. Japan, by contrast, was struggling to produce even destroyers by 1945. Its shipyards were wrecked by air raids, steel was scarce, fuel was rationed, experienced shipwrights had been drafted into the army. The carrier Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship and rushed into service, sank from submarine torpedoes before her flight deck ever launched a plane. This was not simply a tactical failure, it was symbolic. It showed that Japan was no longer capable of completing a modern warship that could survive the open sea. Meanwhile, the United States was launching fleet carriers faster than Japan could replace patrol boats. In war diaries recovered after Japan's surrender, Several senior naval officers recorded their reactions to learning the full scale of American carrier production. Admiral Akagi wrote bitterly, "We thought America could build many ships. We did not understand she could build empires of ships." Another officer noted, "Even if we had won Midway, even if we had preserved our fleet, the enemy would have surpassed us within a year." This was the final psychological blow. The recognition that Japan's decisive victory doctrine, its entire naval worldview, had been outdated before the war even began. The Japanese Navy had been built to repeat Tsushima, a single crushing battle that would break the enemy's will. But America did not break. It expanded. Every ship Japan sank was replaced several times over. Every pilot killed opened a slot for a new, highly trained aviator produced by a flight school system that graduated thousands annually. And every mistake America made early in the war was corrected with industrial speed: better radar, better aircraft, better damage control, better carrier doctrine. By 1945, American task forces looked nothing like the lean formations Japan had fought at Coral Sea and Midway. Now, carrier groups operated in vast rotating rings: strike carriers in the center, escort carriers on the perimeter, battleships and cruisers screening them, destroyers as radar pickets, submarines patrolling ahead. This layered fleet moved across the Pacific as a self-sustaining war organism, its decks swarming with Avengers, Hellcats, Corsairs, and Helldivers. For Japanese observers trying to track its movements, it appeared everywhere at once: Formosa, Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Inland Sea. No matter where American carriers struck, Japan lacked the capacity to defend all fronts. The coup de grace was Operation Tengo in April 1945. When the battleship Yamato sailed on her suicide mission towards Okinawa, the Americans responded not with surface ships, nor with a single carrier group, but with several dozen carriers launching waves of aircraft that obliterated Yamato and her escorts before they could even glimpse the invasion fleet. It was cruelly symbolic. Japan's last great ship destroyed not by superior tactics or luck, but by an enemy whose carrier strength had become overwhelming, redundant, and in Japanese eyes, almost inhuman. After the war, when Japanese officers stood before Allied interrogators and studied the production charts of the U.S. Navy, many fell into stunned silence. They had not known, could not have known, how lopsided the industrial contest truly was. They saw the numbers: 24 fleet carriers, 122 escort carriers, more aircraft engines than Japan had aircraft, more steel than Japan had extracted in a decade. One officer finally said what the rest were thinking: "We did not lose to the American fleet, we lost to the American factories." That realization forms the thematic end of the narrative. Japan did not fear American carriers because they were powerful. It feared them because they were infinite. Every lesson Japan learned, every tactic it developed, every counterstroke it attempted, evaporated against a force that grew larger with each passing month. The United States Navy of 1945 was not just a fleet. It was the physical manifestation of a superpower's industrial will, a navy that never stopped growing, a navy that seemed to draw new strength from every battle. In the end, Japanese commanders understood the final, most painful truth: there was never a path to victory against an enemy that could rebuild an entire navy faster than Japan could rebuild a squadron. The war in the Pacific was not merely a clash of ships, it was a clash of capacities, and capacity dictated destiny.